right, good afternoon, everybody. As Ashley said, thanks for rejoining us from the beautiful outdoor lunch that you just had. I know it's tough to come back in here.
No sleeping.
That's great. Data is such a massive topic and such a critical one in healthcare, so we're really excited for this conversation today. By way of introducing everybody, I'll start. I'm Rachael Newberry. I lead innovation programs for an organization called RIoT. So a lot of my work is in helping both industry and startups and government actually to explore how data is changing the economy and what new opportunities that presents. So healthcare, of course, is a big field where data has the potential for massive impact. And I'm here today with Karl, Irene, and Danielle online. Thank you all for joining me, and I'd love to give you each an opportunity just to say hello and give a brief introduction and your background. So Irene, maybe we'll start with you.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, for the invitation. I'm Irene Woerner. I'm the co-founder and CEO of emTRUTH. This is actually my second startup. My first was publicly acquired by a publicly traded company, traditional VC funded. We focus on making data from anywhere in any shape and size and format easy to integrate and interoperate so that you can actually do something meaningful with the data. My whole career has been in enterprise and mission critical software. I came out of JPL, NASA. And what we do, again, is it's all around the data. It's about making data interoperable because healthcare always has and always will need data from lots of different places in lots of different shapes and sizes because that's what it takes to provide care.
So, Karl Hightower, I'm the Chief Data Officer and SVP of Data Products and Services with Novant Health. I'm 4 years into my stint in healthcare, so I've come from telecom, banking, energy, finance, logistics, manufacturing. So lots of different industries, lots of different roles within it. The key and the criticality of data to drive process improvement and change and action and really transformation across the industry is critical. And healthcare is kind of right at the beginning of that journey. So this is a beautiful opportunity for us to start to look at how do we leverage all of that data so that it becomes more information and true decision support for the clinicians and the patients themselves.
Danielle, let's hear from you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Danielle Ralic, the CEO and CTO of Ancora.ai. My background is in information systems and working with hospitals, public health departments, and pharma to build business intelligence solutions. And at Ancora.ai, we're working on making clinical trials more accessible.
Thanks so much. Cool. So I'd love to have a conversation about just data's kind of journey in the healthcare system. But I think first we want to just baseline, data. It's just like a huge topic, a lot of technology involved today. Just why do we care about data? Why is it so important to think about how we can use data in health?
I can provide some value, I think. So first and foremost, right, data is at the heart of any digital transformation. Same with healthcare. And people always think about data as these sort of cold, imperfect zeros and ones, but really data is about you. It's data about a person, about information that your team is going to need, that is providing you with care. If you break your hand, for example, the people that need to look at your x-rays won't just be the emergency person. It will be your surgeon. It'll be your primary care physician. It will be the person that you go to outsource rehab from. And that information needs to be available because it drives outcomes, it improves outcomes, and it manages costs. And those are the reasons why, right, from a business perspective, is Sasha has actually mentioned, it's something I actually use myself when we talk to people, is that, we got it from IBM, the sales guy at IBM. There's 3 benefits that people need to be aware of. It makes you money because patients will select you, and an uptick in your star rating is tied to revenue. It will save you money. Kaiser, for example, is probably one of the most only privately integrated organizations. And they were able to save, $1 bajillion by just eliminating redundant appointments and redundant procedures. And it prevents people from being fired because this is protected data and you need to be compliant.
Interesting that you said that on that. So, when I look at data, it's really, let's go back to old decision support systems. And you look at the EHR, it's really a means of collecting all that information and storing it. We start to look at, okay, now how do I start to organize that, put some context around it and make it useful? When you're looking at clinical teams, they're really doing an investigation. they're trying to figure out what's wrong, what's going on with you. They get very limited time, and they have a ton of stuff kind of thrown at them. This is where we start to look at cognitive computing and more modern systems. This is the transference to what's called digital health 3.0. You get into is now, how do I actually take all of the work out of it and start to make this useful contextual information so people can make decisions. And we're going to start to see a lot of things outside of that one visit a year or that one visit every 6 months, and getting more into how do I collect all those information points? Because most chronic diseases are a picture on a horizon. They manifest themselves early in subtle ways, and then how do you start to intervene and have people take accountability and work with that information back and forth in order to change their own trajectory. So this is, we start to look at it, there's so much data to collect, but how do I actually make it usable and less confusing to people?
Easy. It has to be accessible. Completely agree with that.
We'll get much more into that. There's a lot of challenges associated with this. But Danielle, I know you do a ton of work in the clinical trial space. So talk about, from your perspective, why is data so critical?
Yeah, so from my perspective, I think there's really two things, and they're kind of touched upon here. But one is the maintenance aspect of, if we're looking at maintaining healthy lives, we need those data points to make sure we're on track, but also that decision-making aspect. And that's something that we see in the clinical trial space, where you need to decide what's the best treatment option for a patient. And without the right data from a patient perspective and from clinical information perspective, it's really hard to make that decision with the right information. So I think data is just absolutely critical in healthcare for making sure we can have people leading their best healthy lives. And again, more maintenance. So hopefully getting ahead of just sick care to actual healthcare, but also for making sure that we're making the best decisions that we can for each and every patient, because we can take all of the data out there and really learn from it. So I think, as we learn more about diseases, or like with the pandemic, we learn what treatments work for certain populations or don't work. All of that should be continuing to come in, so we can be feeding this learning system and improving outcomes, as both my colleagues mentioned.
Awesome. Yeah, so I think we've already heard, as we talk about just the value of data, some of the challenges. It has to be accessible. We talked a lot off stage about how to make data purposeful. So talk about just what are some of the big, hairy challenges we see in healthcare when we're thinking about just how to make data purposeful and usable.
I've done a bajillion and one data warehouses, and so, the problem with data warehouses is that first, people are trying to put their arms around all the data. And so I had Fortune 8 companies, right? They're not only trying to deal with their own petabytes of data, they're trying to deal with their customer and their partners' petabytes of data. What happens then is that you have these incredibly expensive systems, multi-million dollars of expensive systems to build and maintain. And the tragedy is that 95% of that data is never used. And it is so complex that the people that can actually do something with the data don't know how to use it. And that's what we mean by data being purposeful for us, right? Data, like you, is not one size fits all. The way that you consume data when you're doing a dashboard analytics is going to be different from the way that you consume data if you're trying to train a machine learning model to be predictive in terms of someone that might have a propensity for diabetes or hypertension. And so that's what we mean about purposeful data. Data should serve a purpose, answer a question, right? And to have that data be focused specifically on that and trying to figure out what that data is in the sea of information. In my business, from long ago, we called it drinking from the fire hose. And what we want to do is let you be able to take the sips that you need that will quench the need that you have.
Interesting. So there are different architectures and types that have evolved over time, coming from telecom and dealing with homeland security, basically saying, we want it all.
We want it all, right?
Yeah, and us laughing like, you'll never be able to do jack with that. So, hey, but now we start to look at it, this whole data lake, and we start to look at everything that's there. A lot of this is, how do I get that into making all of the crops grow? So how do I start to filter this out? So how do I filter this out? How do I actually get it to the right place? And a lot of the technologies have evolved to where the ideas were before. So now I can start to take this. All right.
We call data lakes the junk drawer of data, right? People throw in a bunch of stuff, especially unstructured data that nobody knows. And so the majority of those projects fail because it's unrelated, unharmonized. People don't want to be the TensorFlow analysis expert. How do you
You're
think?
going to kill them with the TensorFlow stuff.
TensorFlow, that's for you.
But
how-
it goes
how
into
does that work?
understanding how people are going to use it.
Exactly.
So a lake is merely the start.
Exactly.
And if you don't understand how people make decisions,
Yes.
so data is just an input into people making decisions, and it's a result set
Yes.
of how they make those decisions. It's kind of like AI. AI is a tool.
It's a tool.
It is not going to solve everything.
Yes,
It's
yes.
a tool. If you don't understand how people work,
Yes.
how people use these things, then you're just playing with technology.
It's a good segue, actually, right, into the bias into those data sets because, right, for AI, for example, machine learning, those models are well understood. We've been doing them for decades.
Yeah.
The problem is the data. Like even Google had a problem, right? They didn't do facial recognition well because they didn't have enough training data on people of color. And so I think that's where, the data is really paramount to that. If you want to harness technology is just a tool.
Yeah.
So how do you do that? I think
So this
that's
also gets
the,
it. So
that's
let's
the
go
fun
into
part.
so let's go into where do I provide healthcare?
Yes.
So if I don't have data on people because I've never serviced them before,
Yes.
and I'm training a model based off of that data,
Yes.
I kind of have a giant donut in where there's a big hole in the middle of where I'm actually trying to deliver things because I'm not looking at a totality of information.
Yeah.
I'm merely looking at things that I've experienced and that I know.
Yeah, it's
And
a worldview, right?
And that's where you got to kind of take it back. And this is where I'm going to go into the clinical trials, is how do I start to actually do useful things and reach those patients that I'm not normally in touch with.
And Danielle's doing a great job on that
Danielle
one.
is solving this problem. And Danielle, you also had a quote from one of your partners, I believe, about data being this kind of beautiful junkyard in healthcare. So how are you seeing some of those challenges show up in your work?
Yeah, so I think we've seen the hoarding example of just try to get as much data as you can and just put it in one spot, hope that it's useful later. And I think that's just creating this abysmal amount of data that sometimes it's just difficult to even know where to start or what's quality, what's not. And maybe just one example, I went to a doctor's appointment and they went through and asked me all the different drugs that I could take. And they had to answer it to be able to go to the next screen. So they're collecting a bunch of data that really isn't going to help much because the answer was just no. But they have to collect this information because maybe it's useful at some point. And I think from our challenge, it's been the subjectivity of data and also that it's unstructured. And so if you think a lot of the ways we're digitizing healthcare records is someone typing up diagnoses, and we're really having a difficult time structuring this information also as how we understand this information evolves. So all the hierarchies, it's not as fixed. And so we somewhat have moving targets and this unstructured data that we have to somewhat wrestle and see what's worth it. And then we also have the fun challenge of conflicting data.
Yeah.
So from our side, it's been how can we get data and not only structured data, but how can we work with this unstructured data to make it purposeful, to make it useful for the point of clinical trial matching.
Yeah, and it's interesting. So a lot of the clinical trial information that you're having to deal with, it's hard to contextualize. So what are the inclusion criteria? What's the exclusion criteria? And by the way, a lot of that's subjective. So we got to get out of a lot of this is written down and kind of observational, and a lot of that subjectivity. Are you going to sit there and train every single model based off of who wrote that down and whether or not you believe them 100%, 70%, 80%? I mean, that's a lot of things to be able to take and factor in, and this is where you look at how do I get to more discrete, non-subjective information, and that's one of the challenges for healthcare is how do I collect this and bring this in? You start to look at the genomic information, all of the diagnostic equipment that's starting to come in generationally, and how do I start to leverage that in order to help drive those next generation of decisions?
So that's actually where we got we have the innovation front from National Science Foundation. And one of the things that we were doing was that we're not only advancing the blockchain technology so that people can own and control their own data and really secure it, but with all this data that's out there, we're using natural language processing as well as a curated thesaurus that is based off on an ontology like SNOMED that allows us now to tag the data automatically as a first pass of trying to give some context to the data. You'll still need people to look at it, right? Because to Danielle's point, provenance is incredibly important. And that's another reason why you need to have this traceability of data, because you've seen it already, I think, Karl, in the finance industries and in defense and in aerospace. People are going to ask, how did these AI decisions come about? You need to be able to trace that back to how, that you didn't introduce bias, that you didn't do kind of weird cleansing, to make it fit.
Yep.
all these different things. And I think that's coming to healthcare. It's just not a question of if, it's just when.
Yeah, that's interesting. So you mentioned one of the things, what's healthcare based on?
Yeah.
Trust.
Trust, yes.
Trust. All right. So I get asked all the time, well, how does this work? And that gets into how are you having your cognitive computing teams? Are you having your teams actually work and explain and partner together so that you can go through things and see what's usable, what's not usable, where you have opportunities to clean things upstream.
Yeah.
So, and this comes into, I think healthcare will get there, but I think it's a slow process because you have a lot of barriers to overcome because you don't want to make, kind of those bigger mistakes. Because people's lives are at stake.
Yeah, that's why we're very careful. I mean, it's, especially about, we actually have the technology to do automated sharing, right? Mm-hmm. But we don't do it because of the unintended consequences. Mm-hmm. Because it's protected information, you just want to be thoughtful about that whole process. I think it's really important. We're all stewards of data. And, I was at another conference where I was asked to speak, and somebody stood up and said, I think DNA and me or whatever, the 23, they think it's brilliant that when you sign it, that basically you've given them the rights to do anything that you want with the data. I stood up there and I said, you know what, that's just wrong. That is just wrong. Just because you want to figure out what your ancestry is doesn't mean that they have a right to do whatever they want with the data. I think consent should also be contextual and should also be based on purpose. Consent to say, you want to be precision matched for a clinical trial, for Danielle's case. Consent to say, I want to be part of this machine learning data set so that it can help future oncology patients. I think it's about that, and it needs to be specific.
Yeah, and that's the consent. And I was glad that you kind of mentioned blockchain, because blockchain was, for the longest time, a hammer looking around for nails.
Yeah. We don't do crypto, just so everybody knows.
Yeah, and it gets into, so there's a lack of trust.
Yes,
and this is where you have to really look at kind of the criteria to get into blockchain and how it starts to use. And you and I have talked about some of the technology overcoming, but you really have to look at all of the information, this PHI and all these other things. That's useful information.
It's very useful.
Insanely, but as a patient, you got to put some of that power and trust with the person on the side who is kind of the owner of it. Well, so how do I start to work with the systems? How do I start to work? I mean, I have my mobile phone with me. Shouldn't I be able to go, I'm going to authorize for this look of trials?
That's exactly our model. We feel like, that you could grant custodial rights to your primary care provider who can now edit and update and share data on your behalf. Yeah. But according to the intent of HIPAA was portability. But that's been bastardized and really, mutated into the weirdness thing. But really, ultimately, it says, I grant privilege to this person who's providing with care, but if I decide to change providers, I should be able to rescind privilege and grant it to the new one. Yeah. And that's why we believe people should own and control their own data, right? I mean, it's why aren't we doing that?
Absolutely. I mean, we can talk about challenges all day, right? We've already touched on like interoperability, bias, privacy, consent, all of these big challenges. What I love about each of you is that you have now kind of landed in healthcare, but you bring a lot of other industry expertise into your work today. So give folks a sense, like, what are some starting points for addressing these challenges, and how are you working with your teams to knock down some of these barriers to kind of making data purposeful? Danielle, maybe we can start with you on that.
Yeah, sure. So from our side, we're really looking at, I think one of the problems in healthcare is like tech feels like they can just solve any problem and on their own. And so I really think it requires healthcare and technology working very closely together to define these data structures, these hierarchies. What do we mean when we build certain models, and being able to explain them to the points made earlier? Some of the things that we're also doing is, we know we can't solve everything, so let's have hyper focus and understand the context and use that to our advantage to solve maybe small problems, but solve them well. So an example is, we only focus on oncology because having that context of cancer and clinical trials really helps us to make sure that we're picking up on the right meaning of words. One example being, again, we're an unstructured text, but ER gets picked up as emergency room in the context of healthcare. But in the context of cancer and clinical trials, it often means estrogen receptor. But we need this hyper focus and context and this slow build to be able to deliver models that make sense from a tech perspective and healthcare perspective, and just one at a time, build that solid foundation and be able to build off of that, rather than just trying to solve everything and saying, I'm going to have a perfect personalized treatment plan for you in 6 months. we need to make sure we're bringing also medical professionals along with us. Again, I think sometimes tech is built in silos, and then we bring them to medical professionals and say, there you go, solved it for you. But back to trust. If they're not part of this build with us, not part of this journey, why would they trust us, and why should they trust us? And in tech, there's been a lot of overpromise and underdelivery. So we're really careful to make sure we involve patients and providers as we build any technology that will impact them, because building that trust is absolutely critical.
I believe that too. It's about collaboration. You know, I think it's also when we first started doing our technology development in 2017, and I would say people should have the right to own and control their own data. You just hear gasps around the room. And now, you know, it's quite common to say that, and even governments, you know, not in the United States, but, you know, governments are moving in that direction. Governments that have nationalized medicine are already moving in that direction. So I think it's about exactly what Danielle said. For us, for example, we always start with very narrowly focused pilots. Have a definable ROI, it solves a very specific problem, and then we create a roadmap on how they can systematically expand in a safe way, because ultimately, you need to have something that provides assurance, right? You can't just throw something, you know, it's like when people, you know, it's like if your organization wanted to transition EMRs, that's a big lift. I mean, it's multi-year, it's a huge upset in terms of workflow, and so you want to look at ways to interject technology in a thoughtful way, you know, that actually does something. You know, even as a researcher, I always hated what I call mushroom research, right? Which is you do something by yourself in a darkened room and it never goes anywhere. It's, you know, it needs to do something meaningful, and I think it needs to do something meaningful in healthcare, and I think there's a real opportunity here. We picked healthcare because the need is so profound.
Yeah, so I'm gonna go for the non-sexy answer here. Just assume I'm Harry Potter and I'm gonna wizard crap into your hands. What are you gonna do with it? So everybody asks for reports and metrics and dashboards, and goes, okay, so how do you make decisions? A lot of the things we transformed in our operations thing was, how do you want conversations to go?
Yeah.
What are you gonna do? When you're having a conversation with something, do you use the numbers to actually drive certain conversations? And how do you want that to evolve? What are the next questions? So we actually worked with our operations team to go, okay, how are these conversations gonna go? What are the next questions you're gonna have? And we really wanted to know, how do they take all the questions, and then how do they make the decisions get to operationalize?
Yeah, great point. It's a great point.
Because I mean, there's so much. I mean, and people get very fascinated with the GUI tools and the reports.
Yeah, it's not about
and all of these things that
I
go
about
into.
What are you going to do with it?
If someone can't make a decision off of it, we missed.
Yeah.
I find too that when you talk to folks that are non-technologists, the answers that they have in their mind in terms of what they want is not really addressing what they actually need. And so trying to understand what they're trying to answer, what they're trying to solve, in the language that it shouldn't be a tech language, it should be in their language, you know?
But I feel that the tech industry kind of created a lot of their own mess with things like ITIL and, or I call it IT defense. Essentially, you created all these things, go fill out the form, and so you created this whole barrier, and people get frustrated with it, as opposed to, can we just have a conversation? What are you trying to accomplish?
What are you trying to do?
Let's just get some basic stuff. And I think that human element of just what are you trying to accomplish, that goes a long way.
I agree. I totally agree.
Towards looking at what success can be.
And that was the secret of my success, Karl, as a consultant. They used to call me the magic decoder ring, because you have to talk about it in the context that people are actually meaningful, right? Mm-hmm. Not the tech speak.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I mean, there's a lot of technology behind the scenes, but that's irrelevant.
Yeah, it's the tool to get to the outcome, and we have to keep focused on the outcome. But what I love about breaking it down even further to not just what is the health outcome that we're trying to get to, but what does the conversation look like with the patient to get there? It really recenters the patient, and it starts to make data actionable and operational, kind of in the minutia of healthcare. So really interesting that you all are looking at it that way. What else are your teams focused on? There's so many challenges, as we've kind of belabored. How are you thinking about the future of healthcare in your work, and kind of what's maybe the one big outcome each of you are going for?
We are looking for something. When we talk about measuring something, we measure it on actual ROI, right? But some of those ROIs are actually on outcomes in terms of health test results, as an example. if we're doing a pilot, for example, for trying to reduce diabetes, oftentimes at end state they're doing dialysis, and things like that. You want to try to catch them before it gets to that point. And I think those are the things that drive us, right? Our technology is foundational. We could have done fintech. We could have done, NASA. We're on a NASA project, in fact. But we chose healthcare because of the profound difference that we could make. And so maybe it's idealistic, but I really feel like we can make a difference. And that would be the biggest part for me. For someone to say, wow, I got better care because of this. That's our end goal, So it's not my first rodeo, so we wanted to pick something. It's not just about the money. We can do good and do well. Yeah.
Great. Thanks, Irene.
Yeah.
Danielle, what about you?
Yeah, maybe from my side, I could like today, but we picked clinical trials in cancer because really there's amazing medicine stuck in the clinical trial process. And it's because we can't find enough patients for these trials. But if you ask around, not a lot of people are even offered trials. And especially when you get out of the big, it's stuff researchers' heads who happen to remember or memorize all of these protocols, which isn't sustainable. And so for us, our goal is that for every patient, we can make data-driven decisions about who can be on a clinical trial and offer it to everyone. So it's not that only some people have the privilege of having this option, that it can really be decentralized and enabled for each and every patient. But we need to support our healthcare providers with this information because we're at a breaking point for them where they're having to remember too much in terms of information, and medicine's only getting more complicated.
Yeah.
So for us, our goal is really how do we embed healthcare knowledge into our healthcare system and not just keep trying to push it into providers' brains. And I'm hoping clinical trials is just the start of how we can make data-driven decisions and really support decision-making for providers everywhere.
Awesome.
Yeah, so we haven't mentioned data quality, which is a whole mess in and of itself. But you start to look at, you mentioned diabetes, and you go into, all right, so how do I catch that or change that path earlier? And this goes into the patient controls a tremendous amount. When you look at diabetes, type 2 diabetes, and you start to look at continuous glucose monitors and being able to understand what you eat is going to impact that tremendously. So this gets into, one, you don't want to flood somebody with information, although some of us will like that because we're
That's who we are.
Yeah, okay. But it gets into, I don't want to create hypochondriacs either. So how do I create managed guidelines and other things and put that as much in the responsibility of the patient as possible and work with them as a partnership on changing the course of their health.
I read a study about incentives actually working on that component, right? And interestingly enough, the incentive was financial, which is, if you lose this much weight, you get this much money.
So Amazon did that for their employees.
Yeah, and
so it's interesting to look at, and it gets into put the accountability back where it can actually, it should be. I mean, if you look at how much of our health and wellness is of our own ability to change and impact.
I think this will also change. This is another thing about the future, right? Everybody, even every generation I've seen, are becoming more and more comfortable with having a smartphone and being vested and being empowered to, be a part of your own journey, a part of your own process. Because to like Danielle's point, right? The people that want to be in clinical trials, they're self-selecting at this point. Why not make that available to a broader community? But there's a lot of inertia in healthcare. It's one of the things that I see. And I think that, what it takes is, just some success stories. Because, everybody's afraid to go first. And so if you have one, and you can point to that, and it's a measurable case study, I think that will help move the needle. That's what we want. We want to move the needle.
Yeah, but that's a lot of cultural stuff difference between the United States and, say, a country like Israel. Where there is no fear of failure. It is try, and those things, and it's not a failure, it's learning's next step. And how am I backing that financially? You look at, and this is one of the things that's kind of gotten me about innovation within healthcare, and nothing against anyone, it's people look at it as a failure, and you go, no, these are learnings, and innovation is about hitting the home run. It's about pushing that envelope and continually doing these things because you're looking at a longer horizon. If we don't take the steps today, we're not going to go anywhere. So you have to continually look to push that boundary on how you're just interacting with people, collecting data.
So finding the right people that you click with, right, is oftentimes you see somebody and immediately they get what you're doing. Like, we were looking for beta sites for our phase 2 NSF. We went out there. I particularly was sharing, that we wanted to look for organizations that provided care to underserved communities. The people that we got responses from, this one of the CEOs of one of the largest health districts in California. He goes, Irene, you had me at interoperability. Those are the kind of people, right, that you want to work with because they understand the issues. The spectrum of healthcare is not just the 2 hospitals that are anchoring the system. It's the whole thousands of physicians in this network that are not part of that data sharing. It is the outbound patient sources, because, less than the hospital scale, right?
So
outpatient.
I got a question for you. In all the industries that you've been in, one of the things that makes that partnership is your ability to understand the business and their ability to understand the technology.
Yes.
And we've reached a point in time, and healthcare is complicated.
Healthcare is complicated.
It's really complicated.
A lot of acronyms.
Yes, but it's such a broad spectrum of things that are individually complicated.
And their goals are sometimes opposing.
So,
that's the problem.
So how do we get over the barrier of them understanding the technology that's possible in a depth where it now becomes applicable, and the technologists starting to understand kind of the depth of healthcare as well?
I'm a technologist, so I don't claim to be, a clinician or anything like that. What we do to augment what that is that we have a stellar advisory board, and they are stakeholders across the spectrum of healthcare. Our pharma person is one of the top 100 voices in pharma. Our integrated healthcare person is effectively the CEO of Oscar Health on the West Coast. They understand the business. They're clinicians. And what we want to do is we want to understand what they talk about so that we as technologists can say, oh, look, have you considered this as a way of being able to solve this problem? And so I think that collaboration is important in finding people that you can speak with. And that's why, honestly, I don't even talk about blockchain. You don't need to care about that. We do it, we know how to do it, but it's about the problems that we solve in a way that is the lowest amount of pain point for you.
So I'd love to stay on this thread quickly before we have to wrap up, but I know there's a lot of innovators in the audience. You all are each innovators in healthcare. That's really great tactical advice to have, strong voices from healthcare that can help you all to collaborate well. Danielle, in your work, what advice do you have for innovators trying to kind of break into healthcare?
Yeah, I was just thinking as Irene was speaking as well we always heard it's people, process, tech. So the tech itself is not enough. It's who's using it, and then are there processes around it to make sure it's being used? And there's a junkyard of data, but there's also a junkyard of tech. And I think that's the thing you have to be really careful about. And it's so hard to get that trifecta. And I think especially healthcare, it's very guarded. The gates are very guarded. But that's where some of those introductions, such as advisory board members, can be incredibly helpful. But I think you have to be aware of those 3. Because if you start with, if it's great tech, they will come. Not in healthcare. It's just, especially if you're trying to serve clinicians. Yeah, and they're exhausted. I mean, I think that's the thing we keep bumping up against is everyone working in medicine is exhausted, and they've lost a lot of staff with the pandemic. So it is really being mindful of their time, using them only when you need to, but making sure you have that partnership. I think that awareness and humility and appreciation of their work is really, really important, or else you're not going to get the time. And if they're not going to use your tech because they don't believe in it, it's not going to go anywhere. So I would just reiterate that the people, process, tech aspect is super, super critical to deploying something.
Great. Karl, you're with a big system like Novant. What advice do you have to innovators?
I was just going to comment on technology and where we sit. I mean, keep in mind, people just came out of the EHR, everybody having to get on an EHR, and everybody thought the EHR would solve everything, and you mimicked paper. You've electronically mimicked paper.
And so a bajillion standards now.
So now you have to look at the evolution of this as we go forward, and this is really about how do we make things efficient? Because it's hard enough for people to do their jobs. You look through the pandemic, being a nurse and a doctor, working in a hospital during the pandemic was brutally challenging. And then you go, okay, and now I want you to enter these 4,000 things because it's been mandated by the government. So
Yeah.
now you're adding all of these other
Yeah.
things that they've got to go
Yeah.
do on top of that.
They feel like they're note takers. I mean, honestly.
And that gets into, okay, just stepping back and going, how do I make it easier for them to do the job that they're supposed to be
How
doing?
is your innovation lab helping move the needle?
So that goes into, just all of the different tech, being able to put in the little seeds and just communication. Paula does a fantastic job back there running this, bringing in all sorts of things, not just from healthcare, but you also look at like just defense.
Yeah.
Defense has a lot of technology that has little places where it could be used inside of this.
Yeah, that's what we did, right? We brought technology that we brought to bear, for the aerospace industry, because every industry I've ever been in has the same problem. Data is complex. It comes from lots of different places, and you need a way to make it work together and do something, not just sit there, right?
Yeah. I also think we'll see a lot more data generated.
Oh yeah, we have a
Just-
lot now.
I know
every device. Can you imagine?
But you're going to start to get into all of the things. Think how easy it will become just to be able to take a picture of your meal and have it do the calculation of calories or anything of that nature. So you're starting to really get into a tremendous amount more data that you're going to have at time. And that's where you start to get into, how am I working with this? The big one, and interoperability I wanted to get into, is I traveled a ton over my career.
Yeah.
And I was always nervous about ending up in a hospital and not able to speak because, possible allergies to medication and they just might inject you with something. And you drop dead.
Yeah.
So this goes into, how's that medical record evolving into people who have that information when they need it on your behalf.
Yes.
And
completely agree with that.
that's one of the ones where I think the government missed the mark.
Yeah, honestly,
Tremendously.
right? If you're traveling, we want people to be their own walking patient record in a protected way, so that if you're going somewhere and you're on travel, you can even share with that current physician for a limited period of time and rescind that sharing once you're done and back home, right? But the ability should be there. The technology exists today. The question is, people that are willing to actually try it. And so, we look for innovation partners in industry, because there will be leaders, and those will be the ones that will come out ahead, I think. Data is strategic. It's a simple question. If you believe that data is strategic in your business, then what are you doing about it?
Huge opportunity on the value creation side of data. So with our last minute, maybe we can do a rapid fire. I'd love to hear from each of you. What are you most kind of optimistic or excited about when you think of the future of healthcare and the work that you're doing to help us get there?
What I'm excited about is that this is my second startup, and the vibe that I get now, people that are want to collaborate and do things together, I think is the secret sauce to success, because we don't need to own the world. Let's do what we do really well, and then partner with people that do what they do really well, and in combination, we create a more complete solution for what people actually want. I'm excited about that, and I'm excited about we're at a cusp, I think. Healthcare is at a point where it's ripe for change. The pandemic really highlighted some of the struggles. And with every struggle comes opportunity to do something different and do something better. So that's what I'm hopeful about.
Awesome. Danielle, what about you?
I'm really hopeful that what we're working on will come to fruition, which is that we're integrating information about the most newest technologies that we're investigating in healthcare, making that available to every provider across the face of this earth to serve their patients, and creating this feedback loop where, as we learn from patients and what we're seeing with them, those outcomes can be put back into this learning system. And so we only get smarter and treat people better as we deliver more and more healthcare. So I'm really driving for a data-driven healthcare system and not one that's relationship-based.
I'd say we're at a point in time within technology of this industry and understanding of it, so that we're over kind of the know automatically, and now we're into the partnership of ideas. And I think it comes into, how do you take advantage of all the ideas and all the opportunities and execute on them? And I think that's better than the alternative of the constant no. And now we got to get into, how do we do that efficiently? How do we start to not do technology just because it's cute and glitzy, but how are we actually bringing it into hitting on the mark of that process improvement, of something that's useful at the right time? And I think that's where we are now, is kind of that understanding and that acumen on how to use this is big. Everyone says data literacy. I go into data acumen. Now that people need to start understanding how to use it to make decisions, and I think that's a better place to be than where we have been.
Are we in the age of maybe, or are we in the age of yes?
I think we're in the age of maybe, but we're turning a corner. And I think that just comes with time, though.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's something to be optimistic about, for sure. Well, thank you all for sharing your time with us. Thank you for your expertise, and we will move along from here. Thanks, y'all.
Thanks to the panel. Thanks, Rachel.